Before the world would know his name, the sea already knew him. Not as Blackbeard, not as a terror of empires, but as something far smaller and far more ordinary. A boy born into smoke, salt, and shifting tides. His name was Edward Teach, and he entered the world in Bristol, a port city where nothing ever truly stayed still. Ships arrived like floating cities carved from wood and rope, their sails heavy with wind and distance. They left carrying everything England desired: sugar from plantations, tobacco from colonies, rum distilled from empire itself, and human lives traded as cargo beneath the same economic sky. In Bristol, the sea was not scenery. It was structure. It decided who lived in comfort and who lived in hunger. And Edward Teach grew up inside that structure, absorbing it long before he understood it. The docks were never quiet. Even at night, lanterns flickered along the waterline and silhouettes of sailors moved like ghosts between ships. Crates were lifted, anchors were raised, ropes screamed under tension. And voices, always voices, shouting orders that sounded like urgency itself, had learned to speak. This was not a romantic world. It was mechanical. A machine built from timber and salt water and human exhaustion. And every boy who grew up near it understood the same unspoken truth. The sea was not an escape. It was a test. Bristol in those years was not just a town. It was a gateway, a nerve ending of empires. England's reach into the Atlantic world passed through its harbors like blood through a heart. Merchants grew rich here, but only if the winds were kind and the ships returned intact. Sailors, however, lived differently. They lived in cycles of departure and loss. Some returned with coin and stories. Others did not return at all. And many returned, changed in ways that no coin could explain. Edward Teach would have watched this rhythm from a distance. Not as a participant yet, but as an observer learning without permission. He would have seen men arrive after years at sea, with skin burned dark by sun and salt. He would have seen others carried off ships barely able to stand, broken by storms or discipline or disease. And he would have learned something early. The sea did not reward fairness. It rewarded endurance. And endurance could be taught or taken. England itself was changing during his childhood. The empire was expanding outward with increasing hunger. Colonies were no longer distant experiments. They were engines of wealth. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean demanded labor that was brutal and endless. Tobacco from the Americas fed European demand. And ships became the only arteries that connected all of it. Without ships, empire collapsed into distance. With them, it became a global system. And that system required sailors. Thousands of them. Men willing to vanish for months, sometimes years, into a world where land disappeared entirely. Edward Teach entered this world not through heroism or ambition, but through necessity. Like most sailors of his time, he likely began with low-ranking work. Hauling ropes, scrubbing decks, learning how a ship breathes, how it moves, how it survives storms that feel like anger made physical. Life aboard was not freedom. It was structure under pressure. Every movement governed. Every mistake visible. Every man replaceable. But in that harsh order, there was education. Teach learned how crews functioned when fear became normal. He learned how authority worked when it was enforced through exhaustion. He learned how men behaved when land was gone long enough that memory of it began to fade. And slowly, without announcement, the ocean began shaping him. Not into a pirate. Not yet. But into someone who understood violence as a tool rather than a tragedy. The world outside Britain was also shifting violently. Europe was locked in constant competition. The great naval powers, England, Spain, France, the Netherlands, were not just trading with the world. They were fighting over it. Wars between empires rarely stayed on land. They moved across oceans. They turned trade routes into battlegrounds. And they blurred moral lines in ways that mattered deeply for men like Edward Teach. Because during wartime, governments issued something called letters of marque, legal permission for private ships to attack enemy vessels. Privateers were born from this system. They were not pirates, at least not officially. They were sanctioned predators of the sea. And for young sailors, this distinction mattered less than survival. Because a privateer and a pirate used the same weapons. They sailed the same waters. They faced the same storms. And they chased the same prize, survival through captured wealth. Edward Teach entered naval life during this blurred era, a time when legality depended entirely on politics, when one flag meant hero and another meant criminal, and when war ended, those distinctions often disappeared overnight. Sailors who had been legal attackers suddenly found themselves unemployed, armed, experienced, and trained in violence, with no war left to justify it. This transition was one of the most important forces in his life, even if he did not recognize it yet, because it created a generation of men who knew only one reliable system: take or be taken from. And the sea always offered opportunities for those willing to abandon rules. Teach's early maritime years are not fully recorded. History does not preserve the beginnings of men like him with precision. But the pattern is clear. He learned navigation. He learned discipline. He learned survival. And he learned how quickly order could collapse when leadership failed. Storms would have been his most honest teachers. Because storms do not negotiate. They do not care about rank or nationality or law. They strip ships down to their essential truth: wood, rope, and human decision under pressure. It is in this environment that Teach's personality would have formed. Not yet the theatrical terror he would become, but something quieter, observational, controlled. A man learning that fear can be studied and later used. As the War of Spanish Succession intensified, the Atlantic world became even more unstable. Naval battles increased. Merchant routes became dangerous. Privateers multiplied. And ports like those in the Caribbean became crowded with men who no longer knew what side of the law they were on. Edward Teach would eventually move deeper into this world. But at this stage, he is still only a sailor shaped by systems larger than himself. A man learning the language of ships, the psychology of crews, the rhythm of violence disguised as trade. And the ocean, endlessly patient, continued shaping him without announcing what he would become. Because in this era, the line between sailor and pirate was not a border. It was a moment, a decision made when opportunity appeared and law became inconvenient. And somewhere ahead in that uncertainty, Edward Teach was already moving toward that moment. Not yet as Blackbeard, but as a man, the sea was preparing for something far larger than Bristol had ever imagined. The sea did not create Edward Teach in isolation. It refined him through conflict. And by the time he moved deeper into the Atlantic world, the ocean itself had become a vast arena of war disguised as commerce. Ships no longer carried only goods. They carried nations. And every voyage was a silent extension of empire. England, Spain, France, and the Netherlands were locked in a struggle that stretched across continents. But most of that struggle did not happen in royal courts. It happened on water, on decks splintering under cannon fire, on waves stained with broken hulls and drifting cargo. And for sailors like Edward Teach, this meant opportunity was everywhere. But so was danger. The War of Spanish Succession changed everything. It turned the Atlantic into a battlefield where legality shifted depending on who signed a document in Europe. A sailor could wake up a patriot and fall asleep a criminal without ever changing ships. This was the world of privateering. And Teach entered it at the exact moment when the line between sanctioned warfare and piracy was dissolving. A privateer was authorized violence. A pirate was unauthorized violence. But in practice, they used the same cannons, the same crews, the same ships. Only the paper differed. And paper meant little at sea. During this period, Teach likely served aboard vessels operating under letters of marque. Ships that hunted enemy merchant fleets. Ships that blurred morality into profit. Here, discipline mattered less than aggression. Speed mattered more than strategy. And success meant captured goods, not honor. Teach learned quickly that survival depended not only on skill, but on reading human behavior under pressure. How captains reacted when faced with superior firepower. How crews fractured when fear replaced order. How quickly confidence could collapse when a mast snapped or a hull cracked under cannon fire. The sea was a classroom, and violence was the curriculum. When the war ended in 1714, the system that had sustained men like him collapsed almost overnight. Governments stopped issuing privateering licenses. Ships that had once been legal instruments of war suddenly became unemployed armed vessels. Crews were dismissed. Captains were abandoned. And thousands of experienced sailors found themselves in a world that no longer had a place for them. But they still had ships. And they still had weapons. This is where history shifts. Because when structured violence disappears, unstructured violence takes its place. Piracy was not born from rebellion. It was born from economic vacuum. And the Caribbean became its center. Not because it was lawless by nature, but because it was overextended by empire. Trade routes stretched thin across islands and ports. Naval enforcement was inconsistent. And newly unemployed sailors found refuge in places where authority had not yet fully arrived. One of those places was New Providence in the Bahamas, a settlement that would become infamous, a place where pirates gathered not as isolated criminals, but as a loose society of outcasts, opportunists, and former privateers. It was chaotic, but it was also functional. Here, Edward Teach would have encountered a world unlike anything he had known. No rigid command structure. No official discipline. No sanctioned hierarchy from empire. Instead, survival depended on reputation, on intimidation, on willingness to act without hesitation. It was here that Teach began to transition from sailor to something else entirely. Not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually, like a change in weather that no one notices until the sky is already different. He would have joined crews that operated outside the law entirely. Ships that attacked merchant vessels without authorization. Crews that shared plunder according to informal codes rather than naval regulation. And in these environments, personality mattered. Fear mattered. Presence mattered. Because on a pirate ship, authority was not inherited. It was earned moment by moment, and lost just as quickly. Teach's physical presence likely began to evolve during this period. He was not yet the myth of Blackbeard, but he was learning the value of appearance. The sea had taught him discipline. Piracy taught him psychology. And psychology would become his most powerful weapon. Accounts from later years describe him as imposing, intense, deliberately theatrical. But those traits did not appear fully formed. They were built, step by step, through observation of how men reacted to intimidation, through understanding that fear could end a fight before it began, and through recognizing that reputation often traveled faster than cannon fire. In pirate communities, stories spread quickly. A successful raid became legend within weeks. A violent encounter became identity. And identity became survival currency. Teach learned that the man others believed you to be could matter more than the man you actually were. Meanwhile, the Atlantic world continued to shift. European empires were not focused on pirates. They were focused on expansion. Colonies required protection. Trade required protection. But naval resources were stretched thin across global conflicts. This imbalance created space. Space pirates filled immediately. In the Caribbean, piracy became a shadow economy attached to empire itself. Goods stolen from merchant ships often re-entered legitimate markets through corrupt ports. Governors sometimes tolerated piracy when it benefited local economies. Officials sometimes accepted bribes. Law was inconsistent, and inconsistency created opportunity. Edward Teach moved through this environment not as an isolated outlaw, but as part of a broader system of maritime instability. He learned which waters were patrolled heavily. He learned which captains surrendered quickly. He learned which flags inspired fear, and which inspired resistance. Every encounter became data. Every raid became education. And slowly, a pattern began forming around him. Not yet the myths, but the foundation of one. Because in the Caribbean of the early 18th century, reputation was not optional. It was survival infrastructure. And Edward Teach was learning how to build it. Not through mercy, not through diplomacy, but through controlled visibility, through presence, through the idea that resistance against him would be costly even before he raised a weapon. And somewhere in this evolving world of broken laws and shifting empires, the name Edward Teach was beginning to detach from the man who carried it, and start becoming something larger than himself. Not yet Blackbeard, but something close enough that the ocean had already begun whispering it. The ocean does not announce turning points. It simply changes direction, and those inside it either adjust or disappear. For Edward Teach, the Atlantic had already begun shifting him into a different current. The war that had shaped his early years was gone, but its consequences remained everywhere. The end of the War of Spanish Succession did not bring peace to the seas. It brought imbalance. Thousands of experienced sailors were suddenly unemployed. Ships that had once carried legal authority were dismantled or left idle. And men who had learned to fight for crowns were now left without crowns to fight for. Edward Teach was one of them. A sailor trained in violence, released into a world that no longer had official use for it. This moment matters more than any single battle in his life, because it is here that piracy stops being an accident of survival and becomes a direction. The Caribbean in the early 1710s was not chaos in the sense of emptiness. It was chaos filled with structure that no empire fully controlled. Ports existed, but authority was uneven. Governors ruled, but enforcement was inconsistent. Naval patrols were present, but stretched thin across vast waters. And in those gaps between control, something new had formed. A pirate ecosystem. New Providence in the Bahamas became its center. A settlement that should have been minor, but instead became infamous. A place where former privateers, escaped sailors, deserters, and opportunists gathered under no single flag. It was not a kingdom, but it behaved like one. There were informal leaders, shared agreements, unspoken rules, and a constant awareness that survival depended on cooperation, even among criminals. Edward Teach entered this world not as a legend, but as another face in a crowd of men trying to remain relevant in a world that had moved on without them. Here he would have learned something critical. Piracy was not random violence. It was organized risk. Crews formed carefully. Targets were chosen strategically. And success depended on coordination as much as aggression. Ships were not just tools of war, they were economies. Every captured vessel meant supplies, weapons, food, and coin. Every successful raid meant reputation. And reputation meant survival. Teach likely served under established pirate captains during this phase. He was not yet commanding, not yet feared, but observing, learning how authority worked when it was not granted by governments. On pirate ships, captains were elected or accepted. Authority lasted only as long as success continued. Failure could mean removal, abandonment, or worse. This instability created a different kind of leadership, one based on fear, respect, and visible capability. And Teach was studying it closely. Over time, his presence began to change. Not suddenly, but noticeably to those around him. He was not the loudest man on deck, but he was one of the most watched. Because some men attract attention not by speaking, but by how they move through uncertainty. Descriptions from later accounts suggest he was physically imposing, but more importantly, controlled. Control mattered more than strength in pirate culture, because panic was contagious at sea. A single breakdown in discipline could cost a ship. Teach understood this, and he began to use it. Not yet through violence, but through suggestion, through presence, through the growing awareness among crew members that he was not someone easily dismissed. At this stage, piracy in the Caribbean was still transitioning. It had not yet fully entered its golden age identity in historical memory. But all the conditions were forming. Trade routes were expanding rapidly. European colonies were growing richer, and merchant ships became more frequent targets. Every successful pirate raid encouraged more piracy. Every weak response from authorities reinforced the system. It became self-sustaining, and men like Teach existed inside that feedback loop. Not at the center yet, but moving toward it. During this time, ships captured by pirates often changed hands quickly. A captured merchant vessel could be refitted within days and returned to service as a pirate ship. Flags were changed, names erased, identities rewritten. The ocean made reinvention easy. And Teach learned how to navigate this fluid identity system. He would have seen ships stripped down and rebuilt under new leadership. He would have seen crews dissolve and reassemble like shifting sand. And he would have understood something fundamental. Nothing at sea was permanent. Not authority, not ownership, not identity. This realization is what separates sailors from pirates in mindset. A sailor obeys structure. A pirate adapts to its absence. As Teach continued operating within pirate networks, his reputation began to form in fragments. not yet as Blackbeard, but as a capable, intense, and increasingly noticeable figure. Reputation in pirate culture spreads like weather. Slow at first, then suddenly everywhere. A successful engagement becomes a story. A story becomes exaggeration. Exaggeration becomes identity. And identity becomes fear. And fear in this world is currency. By the time Teach was fully integrated into pirate operations, the Caribbean had become a patchwork of unofficial territories. Some islands tolerated piracy. Some profited from it indirectly. Some tried and failed to suppress it. But no single authority controlled it completely. This vacuum allowed ambitious pirates to rise quickly. And Teach was positioned directly in that environment. Not yet commanding a ship, but close enough to observe command in action. Close enough to understand its weaknesses. And close enough to recognize that most captains were not invincible. They were simply the most stable person on unstable water. That realization would matter later, because stability could be challenged and replaced. As the decade progressed, Edward Teach's presence in pirate circles became more consistent. He was no longer just crew. He was becoming something closer to leadership material. Not through formal promotion, but through recognition. Men began to defer to him in small decisions. In moments of tension, eyes shifted toward him. And in pirate culture, that is how authority begins. Quietly, then suddenly. The sea was preparing him now. Not with storms or battles, but with reputation. And reputation, once fully formed, is difficult to escape. Because at sea, a man is never just who he is. He is what others believe he will do. And Edward Teach was beginning to be believed in a very particular way. Not yet feared as Blackbeard, but already understood as someone who would not remain ordinary for long. The sea has a way of erasing hesitation. Not through force, but through repetition. Day after day, wave after wave, decision after decision made under pressure. Until only instinct remains. And for Edward Teach, that instinct was now fully forming. He was no longer simply a sailor passing through pirate waters. He was becoming part of the system itself. The early 1710s marked a turning point in the Atlantic world. The war that had once filled the seas with privateers was gone. But its aftermath had created something far more unstable. A generation of armed sailors with no legal employment. A trade network growing richer and more vulnerable. And colonial governments too stretched or too corrupt to fully enforce order. Into this environment, piracy did not simply survive. It evolved. And Edward Teach was evolving with it. By this stage, Teach was likely operating within established pirate crews that moved through the Caribbean with increasing confidence. These were not chaotic bands of desperate men, as often imagined. They were structured groups with hierarchy, discipline, and shared economic purpose. A pirate crew functioned like a floating republic. Captains were chosen for skill and success. Quartermasters often held real authority over distribution of plunder. And decisions about targets were sometimes debated openly among crew members. It was not democracy in a modern sense, but it was negotiation under survival pressure. Teach would have experienced this balance firsthand. He would have seen how quickly respect could shift when a captain failed, and how fast loyalty could solidify when success was consistent. Piracy rewarded results, not status, and that environment shaped him further. In these years, the Caribbean was filled with movement. Merchant ships carrying sugar, rum, textiles, and enslaved people moved between colonies and Europe in constant cycles. These routes created predictable patterns, and predictable patterns create vulnerability. Pirates learned these patterns. They studied them. They waited inside them. And then they struck. Edward Teach was learning this language of the sea. Not just navigation, but timing. He would have understood that piracy was not random attack. It was economic interception, a disruption of flow, a theft of movement itself. During this period, the settlement of New Providence in the Bahamas became increasingly important. It was not officially governed in a strong sense. Instead, it existed in a fragile state between abandonment and informal control. Pirates used it as a base of operations. Ships repaired there without legal oversight. Crews regrouped there between raids. Information circulated there faster than in any official port. It became a hub of maritime illegality that functioned almost like a parallel society. And Teach was now part of that society. Here, identity was fluid. Men could reinvent themselves easily. Names changed frequently. Reputations were built through action, not lineage. And violence was not exceptional, it was expected. But even within this world, individuals began to stand out. Not all pirates became legends. Most remained names lost to history. But a few developed something more persistent. Presence. And Edward Teach was beginning to develop exactly that. Accounts suggest he was not yet known for extreme brutality at this stage. Instead, his reputation was forming around intensity and control. A man who did not waste movement, who observed before acting, who seemed to understand when violence was necessary and when it was more effective to simply imply it. This distinction matters because piracy is not only about action. It is about perception. A ship that believes it will lose often surrenders without firing. And Teach was learning how to shape that belief. The Caribbean itself was becoming more dangerous during these years. Colonial authorities began to recognize that piracy was no longer a small nuisance. It was a systemic threat to trade. Merchant losses increased. Insurance costs rose. And pressure mounted on European governments to respond. Naval patrols intensified. Hunting expeditions increased. And rewards were offered for captured or killed pirates. This escalation changed the psychology of the sea. Pirates were no longer just criminals operating in gaps of authority. They were targets of organized suppression. And this meant survival required adaptation. Crews became more cautious, movements more coordinated, trust more selective. Edward Teach experienced this shift directly. The sea was becoming less forgiving, and those who survived were those who could anticipate danger before it arrived. During this period, Teach's name begins to appear more consistently in pirate circles, not as a headline figure, but as a reliable participant in successful operations. Reliability in piracy is a form of capital. It means others will sail with you. It means captains will trust you with responsibility. It means your voice begins to carry weight in decisions. And Teach was accumulating that weight. Step by step, raid by raid, storm by storm. He would have participated in the capture of merchant vessels, operations that required coordination, speed, and psychological control over victims. Pirates rarely sought unnecessary destruction. A ship that surrendered quickly was more valuable intact. Cargo crew and vessel could all be repurposed or ransomed. Teach was learning this efficiency. He was learning that violence was not always the goal. Sometimes it was simply the introduction. As his experience grew, so did his awareness of how crews functioned under stress. He would have observed captains closely, studied their strengths, noted their weaknesses, who held authority naturally, and who relied on fear alone. This distinction would become important later, because fear alone is unstable. But fear combined with confidence becomes authority, and authority combined with reputation becomes dominance. By the time Teach was fully embedded in pirate operations, the Caribbean was approaching what historians now call the golden age of piracy. But at the time, it did not feel like a golden age. It felt like instability accelerating. Trade routes were still expanding. Colonial wealth was still increasing. But so was piracy. And both systems fed each other. The more wealth moved across the Atlantic, the more targets existed. The more targets existed, the more pirates formed. And Edward Teach was positioned right inside that cycle. Not at its center yet, but close enough to see where it was heading. Close enough to understand that something larger was coming. Something that would elevate certain pirates above others. Something that would turn anonymous sailors into names that would echo far beyond their lifetimes. And Teach was moving toward that threshold without fully realizing it. The sea was no longer just teaching him survival. It was preparing recognition. And recognition in this world always came with consequences. The ocean never announces when it changes a man. But others notice. First in silence, then in distance, then in the way they stop questioning what he does. For Edward Teach, that shift was now beginning to happen. He was no longer simply another capable sailor inside pirate waters. He was becoming something more difficult to define. Not yet a captain, not yet a legend, but no longer replaceable. The Caribbean in the early 1710s was tightening like a net. Naval patrols increased. Governors in the colonies began to coordinate more seriously with European powers. Piracy, once tolerated in the gaps of empire, was becoming unacceptable. Because it was no longer isolated. It was systematic. Merchant losses were affecting trade stability. Insurance costs were rising. And governments began to understand something that pirates already knew. The sea had become an economy of violence. And Edward Teach was now operating inside the final phase of its uncontrolled expansion. Pirate crews during this time were not chaotic mobs. They were mobile organizations built on survival logic. Every man understood the cost of failure. Every voyage carried risk, not just from enemies, but from the sea itself. Storms could erase months of planning. Disease could weaken entire crews. And betrayal was always possible when profit was divided. Teach had lived long enough at sea now to understand something deeper than technique. He understood psychology under pressure. He understood how quickly confidence could collapse when authority wavered. And he understood something even more important. That most men do not resist power when it is presented clearly. They resist uncertainty. Pirate life rewarded those who could reduce uncertainty. Through violence, through reputation, or through sheer presence. And Teach was developing presence. Not the loud kind. The kind that changes how rooms behave when someone enters. Pirate crews begin to notice these men early. They are not always the strongest. They are not always the most talkative. but they are the ones others watch during silence. Because silence at sea is never neutral. It is anticipation. During this phase, Teach likely moved through several crews and operations. Piracy was fluid. Ships changed hands frequently. Crews disbanded after successful raids. Reassembled again under new leadership. There was no permanent structure. Only temporary alignment around success. And Teach was aligning himself with increasingly successful operations. Each one increasing his exposure. Each one increasing his reputation. In pirate society, reputation spreads like wind over water. A successful raid becomes a story. A story becomes exaggeration. Exaggeration becomes identity. And identity becomes fear. Even before a man fully understands his own image, others begin reacting to it. And Edward Teach was approaching that point. The Caribbean itself was becoming more organized against piracy. Naval commanders were given stronger mandates. Hunting ships were deployed specifically to eliminate pirate crews. And colonial governments began offering pardons to encourage surrender. This created division within pirate communities. Some accepted pardons and attempted reintegration. Others rejected them and became more aggressive. And some began to adapt in a different way. They stopped relying on stealth and started relying on reputation. Because reputation could achieve what stealth could not. A ship that believed it was already defeated often surrendered without resistance. And Teach began to understand the power of this early. Not yet as Blackbeard, but as someone studying how fear travels faster than cannon fire. During this time, pirate warfare was evolving. Early piracy relied on surprise attacks. But as naval resistance increased, direct confrontation became more common. Ships needed intimidation tactics to avoid prolonged battles. This is where appearance begins to matter. Flags were designed to signal aggression. Sails were modified for speed and approach. And crews began using psychological warfare intentionally. Teach absorbed all of this. He understood that the sea was not just physical conflict. It was perception management. And perception could decide outcomes before engagement. By the mid-1710s, Edward Teach was moving closer to the center of pirate operations in the Caribbean. He was not yet commanding his own vessel, but he was no longer invisible. Accounts from later sources suggest he was increasingly recognized within pirate circles as a man of intensity. Not reckless, not careless, but deliberate. A man who did not waste action. And that quality matters deeply in unstable environments. Because pirates did not survive on bravery alone. They survived on judgment. When to attack, when to retreat, when to negotiate, when to threaten. Teach was learning to compress those decisions into instinct. Meanwhile, the broader Atlantic world was tightening further. Spain was attempting to protect its treasure fleets more aggressively. England was expanding its naval enforcement. And France was recalibrating colonial priorities. The result was pressure from all sides. And pressure pushes unstable systems toward collapse or transformation. Piracy was entering its final uncontrolled phase. And within that phase, individuals who understood fear as a tool were rising fastest. Teach was now close to that threshold, close to stepping out of anonymity, close to becoming something that the sea would not treat as ordinary anymore. At this stage, he would have encountered captains who understood the value of spectacle. Men who did not just fight, but performed dominance. Because in pirate warfare, visibility mattered as much as victory. A ship that looked unstoppable often became unstoppable. Not because it was stronger, but because resistance became psychologically expensive. Teach observed this carefully. He began to understand that identity at sea was not fixed. It was constructed, and it could be amplified or erased. And somewhere inside that realization, a transformation was forming. Not yet complete, not yet visible to history, but building, quietly, like pressure beneath deep water. The name Edward Teach was still just a name. But in the currents of pirate society, names rarely stayed just names for long. They became signals, warnings, symbols, and soon, this one would too. The sea does not crown kings, but it creates the conditions where men begin to believe they are one. By the time Edward Teach moved deeper into pirate networks, the Caribbean had stopped feeling like a frontier and started feeling like a system under strain. Trade routes stretched like veins across open water. Ships carried the wealth of empires between islands and continents, and every crossing became a calculation of risk. Piracy was no longer an occasional disruption. It was part of the environment, and within that environment, certain places began to matter more than others. New Providence in the Bahamas was one of them. It was not a capital in any official sense. It had no stable government, no strong military presence, no consistent law enforcement. But it had something more important. It had concentration. Pirates gathered there in numbers large enough to form a society of necessity. Not a nation, but something close enough to function like one. Edward Teach arrived in this world at a moment when it was already self-organizing under pressure. Ships came and went constantly. Crews formed and dissolved like tides. Information spread faster than official communication. And reputation mattered more than origin. Here, a man was not defined by where he came from, but by what he had done. Teach entered this ecosystem as a working pirate. Not a captain, not a myth, but a participant in a system that rewarded decisiveness. He would have seen how crews chose leadership, not through inheritance, but through demonstration. A man became respected because others observed him act correctly under stress, because he made decisions that led to survival, because he did not hesitate when hesitation cost lives. Pirate society was harsh in a very specific way. It did not tolerate weakness, but it also did not reward cruelty for its own sake. It rewarded efficiency, and Teach was learning efficiency. The Caribbean during this period was increasingly unstable. European powers were still recovering from continental wars. Naval enforcement was improving, but not evenly distributed. Some waters were heavily patrolled. Others were barely monitored. Pirates adapted to these gaps with precision. They learned migration patterns of merchant ships. They understood seasonal wind cycles. They knew which ports were corruptible and which were hostile. And Teach absorbed this knowledge through experience rather than instruction. The sea was his teacher, and every voyage reinforced a central truth. Control was always temporary. During these years, Teach likely served on multiple vessels. Pirate life was rarely static. Crews shifted after major captures. Ships were repurposed or abandoned. Leadership changed frequently. But within this instability, reputation began to stabilize certain individuals. Teach was becoming one of those individuals, not yet famous, but increasingly recognized. Accounts from later reconstruction suggest he was not reckless. He was controlled. He observed before acting. And when he acted, it tended to be decisive. This combination is rare in pirate environments, because most men fall into extremes, either impulsive violence or cautious hesitation. Teach was beginning to occupy a middle space, strategic aggression, and in the Caribbean, that balance mattered. Because piracy was not just combat, it was economics under threat. The goal was not destruction. The goal was extraction. Cargo, ships, and crews were all valuable. Excessive violence reduced value, but insufficient intimidation increased resistance. So pirates developed psychological tactics. Flags were used to signal intent. Approach patterns were designed to overwhelm perception. And reputation was leveraged before contact. Teach studied these methods closely. He understood that fear could function as a pre-engagement weapon. If a ship believed resistance was pointless, battle never needed to happen. This idea would later become central to his identity. But at this stage, it was still observation. New Providence itself functioned almost like a pressure cooker. Governors changed frequently. Amnesty offers were issued intermittently. Some pirates accepted pardons and attempted reintegration. Others returned to piracy quickly after realizing official life offered less reward and less autonomy. Teach would have witnessed both paths, and the contrast mattered, because it revealed something important about human behavior in unstable systems. People do not always choose legality or illegality. They choose predictability. And piracy, paradoxically, often offered more predictable outcomes than corrupt governance. Within pirate circles, Teach continued to build presence. Not through speeches, not through titles, but through repetition of effective behavior. He became someone others expected to perform well under pressure. And expectation is the beginning of authority. At sea, authority is never granted in advance. It accumulates, moment by moment, decision by decision. And once accumulated, it becomes difficult to ignore. By the middle of the 1710s, the Caribbean pirate system was approaching its most organized form. This is what historians later call the golden age of piracy. But to those living inside it, it was simply the present. Unstable, profitable, dangerous, and increasingly hunted. Naval forces were adapting. Specialized anti-piracy campaigns were being deployed. Captains known for pirate hunting were rising in reputation. The system was beginning to push back. And within this pressure, individuals who could operate at psychological extremes began to stand out. Teach was approaching that threshold. Still not Blackbeard, but closer to transformation than ever before. Because identity at sea does not shift through declaration. It shifts through recognition. And recognition was beginning to form around him in fragments. A man who did not panic. A man who observed too closely. A man who seemed to understand fear in others before it fully manifested. These fragments would later merge into something larger. But at this stage, they were still scattered impressions, like pieces of a story not yet fully told. The ocean was preparing him, not through promotion, but through accumulation. And somewhere beyond the horizon of his awareness, a name was waiting to form from those fragments. A name that would not belong to Edward Teach for very long. The sea does not create legends in a single moment. It builds them the way storms build waves, layer by layer, pressure by pressure, until something finally breaks the surface. For Edward Teach, that surface was beginning to rise. Not as transformation yet, but as visibility. He was no longer just another capable hand in the pirate world of the Caribbean. He was becoming someone others remembered. New Providence still pulsed as the heart of pirate activity during this period. A place where ships arrived damaged and left reborn under new flags. Where crews dissolved after success and reformed in anticipation of the next voyage. Where lore existed only in fragments and survival filled the gaps. And within this unstable ecosystem, Teach continued to move. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Pirate life rewarded consistency under pressure. A man who could be relied upon during conflict quickly became valuable. And value in pirate society always shifts toward authority. Teach began to occupy that space. He was not yet commanding vessels independently, but his presence in crews mattered. In moments of tension, he was one of the men others looked at. Not because he demanded attention, but because he held it naturally. Pirates learned quickly to read each other. There were no uniforms to hide intention, no formal ranks to guarantee obedience. Everything depended on behavior, on how a man moved during chaos, on how he spoke when plans collapsed, on whether he hesitated when others froze. Teach was developing a reputation for control. Not mercy, not cruelty, control. That distinction mattered deeply in pirate culture, because cruelty without purpose created instability within a crew. But controlled force created order, and order meant survival. During these years, pirate operations became more coordinated across the Caribbean. It was no longer isolated bands attacking opportunistically. It was a network of crews sharing information, routes, and targets. Ships carried intelligence between ports. Rumors of naval movements traveled faster than official dispatches. And Teach was operating inside this information flow. He was learning geography not as maps, but as patterns of vulnerability. Which waters were safest at certain times of year? Which shipping lanes were most profitable? Which ports could be bribed or bypassed? This was strategic learning disguised as survival. And it was shaping his thinking. The Caribbean economy at this time was enormous. Sugar plantations in the islands depended heavily on maritime trade. European markets demanded constant supply, and enslaved labor formed the backbone of production systems that fed global wealth. Piracy disrupted this system at its most critical point: transportation. A single captured ship represented not just cargo loss, but supply chain instability. Insurance costs rose, merchant confidence dropped, and colonial governments felt pressure from both Europe and local economies. This is why piracy was taken increasingly seriously. Not because of isolated violence, but because of systemic impact. Teach was moving through this environment as both participant and observer. He was learning how economic systems reacted to disruption, and how small groups of armed men could influence global trade flows. During this phase, pirate crews also began to refine internal structures. Quartermasters often held significant authority over distribution of loot. This was crucial, because fairness determined cohesion. If crews believed plunder distribution was unjust, mutiny became likely. Teach would have witnessed disputes over shares, over captured goods, over leadership decisions during raids, and he would have learned that authority in piracy was fragile unless continuously reinforced by success. A captain was not obeyed because of position, but because of results. As Teach's reputation grew, so did the subtle shift in how others interacted with him. Respect in pirate society is rarely spoken. It is demonstrated through small changes. Who speaks first in planning? Who others pause to listen to? Who stands closest during uncertainty? Teach was beginning to occupy those spaces, still not formally elevated, but increasingly central. Meanwhile, external pressure on piracy was increasing. Naval patrols became more systematic. Governors were instructed to suppress pirate havens more aggressively, and amnesty programs were introduced to fracture pirate alliances. Some crews accepted pardons, others fractured under pressure. The result was instability even within piracy itself. And instability always creates opportunity for individuals who can navigate it. Teach was one of those individuals. He did not align strongly with surrender movements, nor did he operate as a reckless outlaw. He was positioning himself in the middle space, where survival and ambition overlap. Accounts from later historical reconstruction suggest that during this time he began to stand out visually and behaviorally, not yet through theatrical intimidation, but through presence, a stillness that contrasted with the chaos around him, a controlled intensity that made others uncertain how to read him. In pirate environments, unreadability is power, because predictability invites challenge, and unpredictability demands caution. By now, Teach was close to transition, not yet into full command, but into recognition as someone capable of it. And that recognition is often the final step before transformation. Because once others begin to expect leadership from a man, the system begins to shift around him, whether he asks for it or not. The Caribbean Sea remained restless. Trade continued. Warships patrolled. Pirates adapted. And beneath it all, individuals like Edward Teach moved through layers of instability toward roles they had not yet fully claimed. But the ocean was patient. It always is. And it was preparing to give him a name that would no longer belong to ordinary life. The sea changes men slowly, then all at once. For Edward Teach, that moment was approaching, not as a sudden explosion, but as the result of years of accumulation finally reaching a point where it could no longer remain hidden. He was no longer just moving through pirate waters. He was beginning to define them around himself. The Caribbean in the mid-1710s was reaching a turning point. Piracy had become too large to ignore and too organized to dismiss as scattered crime. Naval powers responded with increasing force. Warships were assigned specifically to hunt pirate vessels. Governors coordinated intelligence more seriously, and safe havens began to shrink. But piracy did not disappear. It adapted, and adaptation favored those who understood psychology as much as navigation. Teach was now operating in that environment, not as a background figure, but as someone increasingly noticed within crews and port settlements. By this stage, his behavior had begun to shift in a way others could not ignore. Not in chaos, but in control. He did not waste motion. He did not speak unnecessarily. He observed situations longer than others were comfortable with. And when decisions were made, he often appeared already aligned with the correct outcome. This creates a subtle form of authority, not declared, but assumed. Pirate crews are sensitive to this, because survival depends on recognizing competence quickly. Teach's reputation was forming in fragments. A man who did not panic under pressure. A man who understood timing. A man whose presence during conflict seemed to stabilize outcomes. These are the early conditions of myth. But myth requires a trigger. And that trigger was approaching. Before that transformation, however, Teach's world was still defined by movement between ships and crews. Piracy in this era was not stationary. It was migratory. Ships changed ownership frequently. Crews disbanded after successful raids. Leaders rose and fell based on recent success. Teach would have experienced this instability firsthand. And within it, he would have learned something critical. Authority in piracy is not inherited. It is performed. Every action is a statement of capability. Every hesitation is a potential loss of respect. And every successful engagement strengthens position. The Caribbean itself was becoming more hostile. Naval patrols were no longer sporadic. They were coordinated. Pirate hunters were gaining reputations of their own. And governments began offering pardons more aggressively to fracture pirate unity. This strategy worked in some cases. Crews split. Some members accepted amnesty and attempted to return to lawful life. Others rejected it entirely. And a third group adapted by becoming more aggressive, more visible, and more psychologically dominant. Teach was moving toward this third space. Because visibility can be a form of protection. A feared ship is less likely to be resisted. A known name carries more weight than an unknown one. And reputation becomes a shield before weapons are even raised. During this period, Teach's presence in pirate operations became more consistent. He was not yet a captain in the formal sense, but he was no longer just crew. He was increasingly involved in decision-making, in planning, in interpreting risk. This shift is important because piracy is not only about action. It is about judgment under uncertainty. Which target to approach, which route to take, when to engage, when to avoid. Teach was developing recognition for sound judgment. And in unstable systems, judgment becomes authority faster than titles do. Meanwhile, the broader Atlantic world was tightening further. Colonial economies were growing more dependent on secure shipping. Trade disruptions were becoming politically significant. And piracy was no longer just a maritime issue. It was a political one. This increased pressure forced pirate communities to evolve again. Some became more secretive. Some became more mobile. And some began to rely on psychological dominance instead of stealth. Teach was absorbing all of this. He was watching how ships reacted to reputation alone. How some captains surrendered without engagement when faced with known pirate vessels. How fear could reduce resistance more effectively than cannon fire. And he began to understand a crucial principle. In naval conflict, perception arrives before force. And perception can decide outcomes early. At this stage, accounts suggest Teach was already developing a distinctive presence. Not yet the full theatrical image later associated with Blackbeard. But something noticeable. A controlled intensity. A stillness that contrasted with the volatility around him. In pirate environments, this is rare. Because most men in such conditions become reactive. But Teach was becoming anticipatory. And anticipation is a form of control. As the 1710s progressed, the pirate world was approaching saturation. Too many crews, too many targets, too much attention from naval powers. Systems under pressure either collapse or reorganize. Piracy was beginning to reorganize, and individuals who could adapt quickly to shifting conditions were rising faster than others. Teach was now close to that threshold, not yet transformed, but no longer anonymous. At sea, identity is never stable. It is always in negotiation between action and perception. And Edward Teach was now entering the phase where perception would begin to outweigh action, where reputation would begin to act independently of physical presence, and where a name, once spoken, would carry consequences before its owner ever arrived. The ocean was preparing to change him completely. And this time, the change would not remain private. There are moments in history when a man stops being observed and starts being believed. For Edward Teach, that threshold was now approaching across the shifting waters of the Caribbean. Not through a single battle, but through accumulation, through repetition, through the slow, invisible building of a reputation that began to travel faster than the man himself. By this stage in the 1710s, piracy in the Atlantic world had reached a strange balance. It was no longer hidden, but it was not yet fully destroyed. Naval forces hunted it aggressively. Colonial governments coordinated more seriously than before, and trade networks adapted to its presence with increasing urgency. But piracy persisted, because it had become more than crime. It had become infrastructure in the gaps of empire. And within that unstable structure, certain individuals began to stand out. Edward Teach was becoming one of them, not yet defined by fear, but increasingly defined by recognition. Pirate crews operate on a simple but brutal logic. Skill is noticed quickly. Consistency is rewarded immediately. And hesitation is punished without hesitation. Teach had survived long enough in this environment to accumulate something rare: reliability under pressure. He did not appear to panic easily. He did not appear to misread situations frequently. And in moments where outcomes were uncertain, his presence often coincided with stability. This is how authority begins in unstable systems, not through declaration, but through pattern recognition. Others begin to expect correct behavior from you. And expectation becomes influence. Influence becomes leadership. And leadership becomes identity. Teach was entering that cycle. Pirate life at this time was still highly fluid. Crews changed composition frequently. Ships were captured, repurposed, abandoned. Leadership shifted based on recent success. There were no permanent institutions to stabilize rank. Only reputation. And reputation moved like weather. A successful engagement in 1 week could redefine a man's position across the entire region. Teach was now within that circulation. Not at the center, but close enough for his actions to spread beyond immediate crews. Stories began to follow him, not yet exaggerated into legend, but distinct enough to be remembered. A man who did not waste movement. A man who understood timing. A man who observed longer than others before acting. In pirate culture, observation is power, because most men act too quickly under fear or greed. Those who do not are rare, and rarity becomes attention. The Caribbean itself was tightening further during this period. Naval patrols increased in coordination. Pirate havens were being targeted systematically. Amnesty offers were used to fracture alliances and reduce crew cohesion. And the psychological environment of piracy began to shift. It was no longer simply a world of opportunity. It was becoming a world of exposure. Every voyage carried higher risk. Every engagement carried greater consequence. And every successful pirate began to stand out more clearly against the shrinking background of anonymity. Teach was now operating in that exposed environment. And exposure changes behavior. Pirates began to rely more heavily on psychological advantage. Because direct confrontation with naval vessels was becoming increasingly dangerous. Ships needed to survive encounters without always fighting. And survival depended on perception. A ship that appeared dominant could avoid battle entirely. A ship that appeared vulnerable invited attack. Teach was learning this dynamic deeply. He observed how certain captains controlled encounters before cannon fire began. How flags, positioning, and approach speed could determine whether a merchant vessel surrendered instantly or resisted. And he began to internalize a critical truth. Violence is often unnecessary when fear is established early. During this period, Teach's presence within pirate networks became more significant. He was not yet commanding his own independent operations, but he was increasingly involved in high-stakes decisions. This is an important transition phase, because leadership in piracy is not assigned. It is absorbed. Others begin to defer, not formally, but practically. In moments of uncertainty, attention shifts toward individuals who have demonstrated stability. Teach was becoming one of those individuals. At the same time, the Atlantic world outside piracy was becoming more structured. Trade routes were more heavily protected. Colonial economies were more interdependent. And naval strategy became more systematic. Piracy was no longer an uncontested side effect of empire. It was a targeted problem. And targeted problems attract specialized responses. This increased pressure forced pirate communities to adapt in different ways. Some reduced activity, some fragmented, and some began to rely more heavily on reputation as a form of defense. Because in an environment where engagement is risky, perception becomes protection. Teach was now close to this shift, not yet embodying it fully, but moving directly toward it. Accounts from later reconstructions suggest that during this phase, he was already beginning to stand out visually and behaviorally. Not through chaos, but through controlled intensity. A stillness that suggested calculation. A presence that made others measure their actions more carefully. In unstable environments, this is the beginning of dominance. Because people begin adjusting their behavior around you before you ever act. And once that happens, you no longer need to prove anything constantly. The environment begins doing it for you. By the end of this phase, Edward Teach was no longer just another name moving through pirate waters. He was becoming a reference point, a man others could describe even without knowing him personally. And that is the moment where identity begins to separate from individual, where a person starts to become something larger than their immediate actions, something that travels ahead of them, something that waits for them in every harbor. The sea had not yet completed his transformation, but it had already begun speaking his name in different tones. And soon, it would speak it differently everywhere. The sea begins to change a man long before the man realizes it. But the world begins to notice only when the change becomes inconvenient. For Edward Teach, that inconvenience was now spreading across the Caribbean like an approaching storm. Not yet fully formed into legend, but no longer contained within anonymity. Piracy in this era had become a pressure system. Too many ships, too many ambitions, too many armed men with no fixed allegiance, and too much wealth moving through predictable routes. It was an unstable equation, and every unstable system eventually produces individuals who can exploit its contradictions. Teach was entering that role. By this stage, he was no longer simply a participant in pirate operations. He was becoming a reference point within them, a man whose presence altered decisions, not through command, but through expectation. In pirate culture, this is a critical shift, because authority is not granted formally. It is recognized gradually, first in small choices, then in shared judgment, then in moments of crisis where others stop asking and start aligning. Teach was now inside that progression. The Caribbean itself was becoming more hostile to piracy during this period. Naval patrols were more coordinated. Intelligence networks improved, and colonial governments began treating piracy not as scattered crime, but as organized disruption of trade systems. This meant pirate crews were no longer just fighting merchant vessels. They were increasingly being hunted. And being hunted changes behavior. Crews became more mobile, more selective, more cautious, but also more dependent on psychological advantage, because direct confrontation with naval warships carried increasing risk. And this is where Teach's evolution becomes important. He was not simply adapting to violence. He was adapting to perception. Pirate encounters often began long before physical contact. A ship spotted on the horizon was already entering a psychological battlefield. Flags mattered. Silhouettes mattered. Approach patterns mattered. And reputation mattered most of all. Teach understood this dynamic deeply. He observed how certain ships surrendered without resistance when faced with known pirate vessels. He observed how fear could eliminate conflict before it began. And he began to internalize a principle that would define his later identity. Control the perception, and you control the encounter. At this stage, Teach was still operating within shifting crews and alliances. Pirate life remained fluid. No permanent structure existed. Leadership changed based on success, and reputation circulated faster than formal rank. Teach's reputation was now circulating, not as myth yet, but as recognition. A man who did not panic. A man who calculated under pressure. A man who understood when aggression was necessary and when presence alone was enough. This combination made him valuable, because pirate crews did not survive on strength alone. They survived on decision-making under uncertainty. And Teach was increasingly associated with good decisions. This is how transformation happens in unstable systems, not through sudden elevation, but through repeated association with successful outcomes. Meanwhile, the Atlantic world was tightening further. European empires were expanding their administrative control over colonies. Trade routes were becoming more formalized. Naval enforcement was becoming systematic rather than reactive. And piracy was increasingly defined as a priority threat. This increased pressure had a paradoxical effect. It did not eliminate piracy. It refined it. Less opportunistic violence survived. More strategic operators remained. And those who understood reputation began to rise faster than those who relied on surprise alone. Teach was now positioned within this refined environment. And refinement favors adaptability. During this period, pirate communities also began to develop more conscious psychological tactics. Some ships used flags not just for identification, but for intimidation. Some crews approached targets in formations designed to overwhelm perception. And some captains cultivated reputations intentionally to reduce resistance. Teach was absorbing all of this, not as theory, but as lived experience. He was watching how fear moved through water faster than wind. He was observing how stories of violence traveled between ports and altered behavior before ships even arrived. And he was learning something essential. Reputation is a force multiplier. At sea, this realization is transformative because it allows smaller power to influence larger outcomes. A ship does not need to be stronger if it is believed to be unstoppable. And belief spreads faster than truth. By now, Teach's presence in pirate networks was no longer minor. He was increasingly recognized within operational contexts, not as commander yet, but as someone whose judgment carried weight. And in unstable systems, judgment is the precursor to authority. Because when outcomes become uncertain, others begin to rely on those who have previously reduced uncertainty successfully. Teach was becoming that reference point. The Caribbean itself was reaching a saturation phase. Too many conflicts, too many patrols, too many competing interests, and too many actors trying to control the same waters. In such environments, visibility becomes unavoidable. And visibility creates identity. Edward Teach was now approaching that boundary, where a man stops being one among many and begins becoming one of the few remembered. The ocean had not yet completed his transformation, but it had already begun assigning him meaning. And meaning, once assigned in unstable systems, rarely stays small for long. The sea does not respect ambition, but it rewards those who learn how to bend perception before reality arrives. By this point in Edward Teach's life, the Caribbean was no longer just a space of movement. It had become a space of attention. Every ship was watched. Every port carried intelligence. And every known pirate name carried weight before a single cannon was fired. Teach was now entering that world not as an unknown sailor, but as a developing signal within it. Not yet Blackbeard, but no longer invisible. Piracy in this phase of the 1710s had reached a strange maturity. It was no longer chaotic opportunism alone. It had become structured improvisation. Crews understood patterns of trade. They understood naval patrol routes. They understood seasonal vulnerabilities in merchant shipping. And they understood that survival depended less on bravery and more on timing. Edward Teach had learned this deeply. He was no longer reacting to the sea. He was reading it. The ocean has no voice, but it has repetition. Winds follow cycles. Trade follows routes. Naval ships follow orders. And pirates who survive long enough begin to see these patterns as clearly as land maps. Teach was now operating with that awareness. And awareness changes behavior. In pirate operations, encounters with merchant ships were becoming more psychological than physical. The first sighting mattered more than the first shot, because most ships made decisions before engagement. A captain under pressure would decide within moments whether resistance was worth the risk. And that decision was shaped by reputation. Teach had begun to understand this mechanism, not as theory, but as applied reality. He saw how fear traveled ahead of ships, how stories of violence made resistance collapse faster than cannon fire could begin, and how uncertainty in a crew led to surrender before command could stabilize. This is where his mindset begins to shift from participant to strategist, not through formal promotion, but through perception of patterns others were not fully tracking. Pirate crews are sensitive to these individuals because they reduce risk. A man who understands when resistance is pointless preserves lives and cargo. A man who understands when aggression is necessary wins encounters quickly. And Teach was beginning to be seen as someone who understood both. At this stage, he was likely operating within more successful and coordinated pirate ventures. Crews that moved with intention rather than desperation. Ships that targeted high-value merchant routes. Operations that required planning, timing, and disciplined execution. These were not random acts of violence. They were calculated interruptions of trade systems. And Teach was now embedded within that logic. The Caribbean itself was becoming increasingly militarized in response. Naval patrols expanded. Convoys became more common. And piracy was being treated as a systemic threat to imperial economics. This escalation changed everything. Because when suppression increases, only the most adaptive survive. And adaptation begins to favor those who can operate with psychological efficiency. Teach was now in that selection environment. And selection environments produce outliers. Pirate society also began to shift internally during this period. Leadership became more unstable due to external pressure. Crews split more frequently. Trust became harder to maintain. And reputations became even more valuable as stabilizing forces. Because when everything else is uncertain, belief in capability becomes structure. Teach was accumulating that belief. Slowly, quietly, consistently. In this phase, he was no longer just another capable sailor. He was becoming someone others referenced during planning. Someone whose judgment was considered before action. Someone whose presence during operations was associated with reduced chaos. This is the threshold of emerging leadership. Not declared, but assumed. Meanwhile, external forces continued tightening. Colonial administrations began coordinating more aggressively. Naval commanders were incentivized to eliminate known pirate threats. And intelligence sharing improved between ports. The ocean was becoming harder to operate in anonymously. And anonymity had always been piracy's greatest protection. As that protection eroded, reputation became more important than stealth. And Teach was positioned exactly at that transition point. He was not yet the figure that history would later remember, but he was already functioning within the logic that would create that figure. Pirate encounters increasingly relied on pre-established perception. A ship with a feared reputation could approach targets with minimal resistance. A lesser-known crew had to fight for every engagement. Teach was beginning to understand this imbalance. And more importantly, he was learning how to use it. Because in unstable systems, perception can be shaped. Not instantly, but incrementally, through repeated behavior, through consistent outcomes, through the gradual accumulation of stories told by others. By the end of this phase, Edward Teach had become something important in pirate ecosystems. Not dominant, but recognizable. And recognition in this world is never neutral. It is either an opportunity or a warning. The ocean had not yet revealed his final form. but it had already ensured that whatever came next would not go unnoticed. There are moments when a man stops operating inside history, and history begins reacting to him. For Edward Teach, that moment was now approaching with the quiet inevitability of a tide rising beyond its normal line. The Caribbean was no longer a scattered field of opportunity. It was becoming a controlled zone. Naval patrols were coordinated across colonies. Trade routes were increasingly protected. And piracy, once tolerated in the gaps of empire, was now treated as a direct economic threat. This shift changed everything, because pirates were no longer just fighting merchants. They were now being actively hunted. Edward Teach was operating inside this tightening world. And pressure changes behavior. Pirate crews became more selective, more cautious, more dependent on intelligence and reputation. Encounters at sea were increasingly decided before ships even came within cannon range. Because perception had become the first battlefield, Teach understood this better than most. By this stage of his development, he was no longer just reacting to pirate life. He was interpreting it. He had learned that ships did not simply fear firepower. They feared certainty. A crew that believed resistance would fail often surrendered without engagement. And belief traveled faster than wind across water. This is where Teach's evolution becomes visible in hindsight. Not as sudden transformation, but as accumulation of psychological insight. He had watched enough encounters now to understand a consistent pattern. The outcome of a confrontation was often decided in the first moments of visibility. Flags, silhouettes, approach angles, speed, and reputation. Each element contributed to a decision made inside the opposing ship long before combat began. Teach was beginning to internalize this logic, not as abstract understanding, but as operational awareness. Pirate society itself was also shifting during this period. As naval pressure increased, crews became less stable. Leadership became more contested, and reputation became the most reliable currency. A captain was only as strong as the belief in his ability to succeed. And belief could be destroyed quickly. One failed encounter, one moment of hesitation, one visible weakness. Teach was operating in this environment as someone whose presence increasingly reduced uncertainty. Not because he commanded formally, but because others began to associate him with stable outcomes. This is the quiet foundation of authority. It does not begin with titles. It begins with trust under pressure. Meanwhile, the Atlantic economy continued expanding. Colonial production increased. Trade volume rose. And maritime routes became more essential than ever to imperial wealth. Which meant piracy, despite all suppression efforts, remained structurally significant. Because wherever there is concentrated movement of value, there is opportunity for disruption. And disruption attracts those willing to operate outside law. Teach was now positioned in that tension point between system and disruption. Not as an outsider completely, but as someone increasingly defined by how systems responded to him. At this stage, his reputation had begun to circulate more widely. Not as legend yet, but as recognition among sailors, merchants, and coastal settlements. A name associated with intensity, with control, with a kind of calculated presence that suggested experience beyond average crews. And reputation in maritime worlds is never contained. It spreads through ports. through ships, through conversations between men who will never meet the person they are describing. Teach was now entering that diffusion stage, where identity begins to travel ahead of physical presence. This is a critical transformation, because once a man is known before he arrives, his arrival changes the behavior of others. Piracy in this era was increasingly shaped by this psychological dynamic. Ships that believed they were facing a feared crew often surrendered early. Ships that underestimated an opponent often fought and suffered losses. Teach was beginning to exist inside that perception gap, not yet fully defining it, but contributing to it. Naval authorities were also becoming more systematic in their approach. Intelligence gathering improved. Reports of pirate activity were shared across colonial administrations, and targeted operations were increasingly deployed. This meant that pirate identity was no longer just local. It was becoming regional, and eventually imperial. Edward Teach was now inside a system that was beginning to recognize individuals as strategic threats rather than isolated criminals. That shift matters, because once a system begins to recognize a man as significant, it begins building responses around him. At this stage, Teach was still moving through crews and operations, but the nature of his involvement was changing. He was increasingly associated with planning decisions, with situational judgment, with moments where hesitation from others required someone to stabilize direction. And stability under uncertainty is one of the earliest forms of leadership recognition. Not formal, but functional. By the end of this phase, Edward Teach was no longer just another experienced pirate. He was becoming part of the decision structure within pirate operations, a man whose presence influenced outcomes indirectly. And in unstable systems, indirect influence often becomes direct power over time. The ocean had not yet given him his final identity, but it had already ensured that his presence would increasingly reshape the environment around him. And once that begins, there is rarely a return to anonymity. The sea had begun to remember him, not as a single act, but as a pattern. And patterns, once recognized, become difficult to erase. Edward Teach was now moving through the Caribbean in a world that had started to tighten around piracy like a closing fist. Naval patrols were no longer reactive. They were deliberate. Intelligence networks were no longer informal. They were coordinated. And colonial governors were no longer uncertain about piracy's impact. They were actively pressured to eliminate it. But pressure does not erase systems that have already adapted. It only changes what survives within them. And what was surviving now were not the weakest pirates, but the most perceptive. Teach was entering that selective layer of survival, not through a single defining moment, but through sustained recognition in the pirate world itself. By this stage, his reputation was no longer purely local. It had begun to travel between ports, between crews, between ships that had never encountered him directly but had heard enough to form expectations. And expectation is one of the most powerful forces in maritime conflict, because it acts before contact. A ship that expects defeat behaves differently before the first cannon is fired. A crew that expects fear reacts differently under pressure. And Teach was now associated with that expectation effect, not yet as myth, but as anticipation. Inside pirate networks, he was increasingly recognized as someone whose judgment under pressure mattered. Not formally elevated, but functionally important. In pirate culture, this distinction is everything. Because leadership is not assigned. It is deferred to. And Teach was now receiving that quiet deferral in moments of uncertainty. When decisions became unclear, attention began shifting toward him. This is the invisible stage of transformation, where a man does not yet command, but others begin aligning around his judgment. At sea, this often happens without discussion. A pause before action, a glance during planning, a silence that waits for input. Teach was now inside those silences. Meanwhile, the Caribbean continued its transition into heightened enforcement. Naval vessels were deployed with clearer objectives. Pirate hunting became more structured, and colonial governments began treating piracy as an economic destabilizer rather than isolated crime. This meant pirate survival required greater sophistication, not just in combat, but in anticipation. Where patrols would be, how information traveled, which routes became dangerous faster than others. Teach was operating within this increasingly predictive environment. And prediction changes behavior. Pirates who survived began relying more heavily on reputation systems, because reputation could replace direct confrontation. A feared ship might never need to fire a shot. A lesser-known crew might be forced into combat simply to prove itself. Teach was now beginning to exist within this imbalance, not fully controlling it, but benefiting from it. His presence in pirate operations was increasingly associated with stability in uncertain situations. He was not yet defining strategy alone, but he was influencing it. This is the threshold between participation and authority, and thresholds are rarely visible while being crossed. At this stage, Teach would have been exposed to increasingly complex pirate operations. Larger crews, more coordinated attacks, higher value targets, and more dangerous naval responses. Each engagement reinforced the same lesson. Survival depended on reading situations faster than opponents, and Teach was becoming known for that speed of interpretation. Not physical speed, but cognitive speed under pressure. In pirate environments, this matters more than strength, because hesitation is often fatal. By now, his reputation had begun to detach slightly from individual identity. Stories circulated in fragments, not always consistent, but consistently intense. A man who did not lose control in chaos. A man who seemed to understand when conflict would resolve before it escalated. A man others observed during critical moments. These fragments were the early structure of myth. But myth requires amplification, and amplification was approaching. Externally, the Atlantic world was becoming increasingly organized against piracy. Convoys were being used more systematically. Naval coordination improved, and pirate activity was being mapped with increasing accuracy. This meant anonymity was shrinking rapidly. And in shrinking anonymity, reputation expands. Edward Teach was now entering that expansion phase, where his name began to carry meaning beyond immediate encounters, where he became part of maritime awareness rather than local rumor. This is the final stage before transformation into legend. Because once a man is widely anticipated, his actions begin to be interpreted differently. Neutral events become significant. Small victories become symbolic. And presence alone becomes narrative. Teach was approaching that point, not yet fully transformed into the figure history would remember. but already functioning as if he might be. And in unstable systems, that perception is often enough to complete the transition. The ocean had not yet given him his final identity, but it had already ensured one thing. Edward Teach would not remain ordinary much longer. There is a point in every man's life at sea when escape stops being possible. Not because the ocean becomes smaller, but because the world above it begins to look for him. For Edward Teach, that point had arrived. The Caribbean was no longer just reacting to piracy. It was actively organizing against it. Naval patrols were coordinated with increasing precision. Colonial governments exchanged intelligence more efficiently. And pirate activity was being tracked not as scattered incidents, but as patterns that could be hunted. Teach was now inside that hunted pattern, not as a minor participant, but as a recognized presence within pirate networks. By this stage, his reputation had already begun to circulate beyond direct contact. Ships that had never seen him spoke of him. Ports that had never hosted him mentioned his behavior. And crews that had never fought alongside him still adjusted expectations based on his name. This is the moment where a man stops belonging only to himself, because perception begins operating independently of reality. And Edward Teach was entering that separation. In pirate culture, this is dangerous, because once reputation precedes you, every encounter changes shape before it begins. Merchants surrender faster. Naval commanders prepare more aggressively, and allies behave more cautiously. Teach was now existing inside that altered environment. But something else had also changed. He was no longer just being observed. He was being actively evaluated, not just by pirates, but by colonial authorities. Reports of his activity, fragmented though they were, had begun to accumulate. Descriptions varied. Some emphasized discipline. Others emphasized intensity. Others focused on his growing presence within pirate operations. But together, they formed a consistent impression. A capable and increasingly influential pirate figure operating in the Caribbean. And once a figure becomes recognizable in official reports, he becomes actionable. This is the point where Edward Teach begins transitioning from pirate participant to target. Naval forces were now increasingly tasked with suppressing pirate leadership structures rather than just ships, because authorities had realized something important. Piracy was not just individual crime. It was networked behavior, and Teach was increasingly perceived as part of that network's rising structure. At sea, this changes everything, because once you are considered structurally important, you are no longer just fought. You are pursued. During this period, Teach's movements became more consequential. Every engagement carried higher risk. Every appearance carried potential recognition. And every decision became part of a growing profile that others were constructing about him. He was no longer operating in anonymity. He was operating in visibility. And visibility at sea is never neutral. It either protects you or exposes you. Teach was now at that crossroads. Pirate life itself was also shifting rapidly under pressure. Crews were fragmenting more frequently due to amnesty programs and naval pressure. Some pirates accepted pardons. Others attempted reintegration into colonial society. But many remained active, becoming more cautious and more strategic in their operations. Teach was among those still active, and continued activity under pressure tends to concentrate capability. Less reckless pirates survive longer. More disciplined ones gain influence. And Teach was increasingly associated with discipline under uncertainty. Not formal discipline, but behavioral consistency. He did not appear to panic easily. He did not appear to act without observation. And he did not appear to lose control in chaotic situations. These traits made him valuable. And value in unstable systems always attracts attention. Externally, the Atlantic world was reaching a stage of maximum maritime enforcement expansion. Convoy systems became more common. Warships were deployed strategically along trade routes. And pirate intelligence became a formal concern for colonial administrations. This meant piracy was no longer just a background threat. It was a prioritized military problem. And in prioritized systems, individuals become targets faster than groups. Edward Teach was now within that category of individuals, not yet fully isolated, but increasingly distinguishable. At this stage, accounts begin to converge around a consistent impression of him. A man associated with increasing authority within pirate circles. A man whose presence influenced operational decisions. A man whose reputation was growing beyond direct contact. And this is where transformation begins to accelerate. Because once perception stabilizes, reality starts adjusting to it. Pirate encounters involving Teach began to carry more weight. Not necessarily because he had changed dramatically in a single moment, but because others were beginning to treat him differently in anticipation of what he might do. And anticipation alters outcomes. Ships surrender earlier. Crews hesitate longer. Command structures fracture under uncertainty. Teach was now operating inside that psychological environment, and it was expanding around him. The sea had not yet fully revealed what he would become, but it had already ensured that every future encounter would be shaped by expectation. An expectation, once established, is difficult to escape, because it follows a man even when he is not present. And soon, Edward Teach would no longer need to arrive to be known. There are men the sea forgets the moment they drown. And there are men it refuses to forget even after their bodies are gone. Edward Teach was about to become the second kind. By the final stage of his life, the Caribbean was no longer a space of opportunity for pirates. It was a closing trap. Naval forces had intensified their campaigns. Colonial governors were coordinating more directly with European admiralties. And pirate havens that once offered safety were now under constant pressure. The world that had allowed piracy to flourish was contracting. And within that contraction, only the most feared or most adaptive could survive. Teach had become one of those names that moved ahead of him. Not fully myth yet, but no longer just a man. He was a reputation traveling faster than sails. A presence inferred before arrival. A warning carried between ships. And in maritime conflict, that kind of identity changes everything. Because when a name becomes expectation, every encounter begins with imbalance. At this stage, Teach was no longer operating as an anonymous pirate. He was part of a shrinking group of high-recognition targets. Ships that were not just dangerous, but known. And being known is the beginning of isolation. Naval forces were now actively hunting pirate leaders rather than general crews. Intelligence reports had begun to circulate more consistently. Descriptions of prominent pirates were refined and shared. And Edward Teach had become one of those increasingly recognizable figures. Not yet fully mythologized, but no longer ambiguous. This is the final phase before collapse in systems like piracy. Because once identification becomes reliable, removal becomes possible. Teach was now inside that equation. His presence in pirate waters was no longer just operational. It was strategic. Every sighting mattered. Every engagement carried heightened risk. And every rumor contributed to the growing pressure surrounding him. Piracy had always depended on invisibility to some degree. But Teach was no longer invisible. He was becoming visible enough to be targeted. And that changes behavior fundamentally. In this final phase of his life, Edward Teach existed in a world where reputation had fully detached from physical limitation. Ships reacted to his name before seeing him. Crews interpreted encounters through pre-existing fear. And naval commanders treated him as a priority objective. This is the moment where a man becomes larger than his own actions. Not through power alone, but through accumulation of perception. The sea had built him slowly over years. Through instability, through repetition, through adaptation to systems that were themselves unstable. And now it was compressing everything into a final convergence. Because in maritime history, men like Teach do not fade gradually. They converge toward an end point shaped by the very reputation that sustained them. The details of his final confrontation are shaped by this same logic. A pursuit organized by naval forces determined to eliminate a high-value pirate target. A crew reduced not just by battle, but by pressure. And a final encounter that turned reputation into inevitability. Teach did not face the world as an unknown man. He faced it as an expectation already formed. And expectations, once solidified, rarely allow escape. In the final moment, what remained was not just a pirate, but the culmination of everything that had been built around him. Fear, recognition, reputation, and the long Atlantic system that had shaped him from the beginning. His death did not end the story immediately, because some identities do not disappear when the body falls. They continue through reports, through stories, through repeated retellings that shift fact into symbol. Edward Teach became one of those symbols. Blackbeard was no longer just a man who lived. He became a structure of fear that outlived the moment of his death. And the sea, which had built him slowly over years of pressure and perception, kept him alive in memory far longer than it kept him alive in flesh. Because legends are not created at the moment of death. They are created in the accumulation of everything that leads there. And Edward Teach had accumulated enough to outlast himself. The ocean did not forget him. It simply stopped needing him. And the world that remained kept telling his story anyway. Like and subscribe and comment what topic you would like to see covered in the next video.